A quiet single dad saw a single mom left alone at a party, then he did this with her. The torrential rain beat against the reinforced glass of the Skyview Executive Terminal in Seattle, blurring the lights of the private runways outside. Inside, the private lounge was a sanctuary of polished Italian marble, soft leather, and the quiet murmurs of the ultra-wealthy. Adrian Cole stood near the edge of the grand entrance, his large hand gently wrapping around the smaller, trembling hand of his 5-year-old daughter, Maya Cole. Adrian wore a simple, faded Navy technician jacket with his name stitched over the pocket, a stark contrast to the tailored tuxedos and evening gowns filling the room. Maya clung to his leg, her bright yellow raincoat still dripping slightly onto the pristine floor, her wide brown eyes overwhelmed by the crowd. Adrian had only come inside to find a safe place for Maya to sit while the severe storm passed, but his presence had already disrupted the carefully curated atmosphere. Marcus Reed, a junior executive with a perfectly pressed suit and a habit of looking down his nose at anyone making less than 6 figures, paused mid-sentence. He nudged Daniel Foster, the senior vice president of operations, pointing a polished leather shoe toward Adrian. Daniel's expression turned instantly to one of disgust. He marched across the marble floor, his footsteps echoing loudly enough to draw the attention of nearby guests. Among them was Victoria Lang, a wealthy socialite and major shareholder, who raised her diamond-encrusted glasses to inspect the intrusion. "What is the meaning of this?" Daniel demanded, his voice cutting through the soft jazz playing in the background. "Adrian, you are a line mechanic. This lounge is reserved exclusively for Tier 1 clients and executive board members. You are tracking rainwater across a $1 million floor, and you brought a child into a restricted high-security area. Leave immediately before I have security escort you out." Adrian did not flinch. His posture remained perfectly straight, his shoulders broad and square. There was a quiet, unshakable masculinity in the way he stood, placing himself slightly in front of Maya to shield her from Daniel's harsh tone. His voice, when he spoke, was low, deep, and remarkably calm. "The storm knocked out the power grid in the maintenance hangar," Adrian said, his eyes locking onto Daniel's with a steadiness that made the executive blink. "The heating went out, and the temperature is dropping fast. I brought my daughter in here for 20 minutes so she could stay warm until my shift ends. I will clean up the water myself." Victoria Lang let out a sharp, aristocratic laugh, stepping forward beside Daniel. "Your daughter's comfort is not the concern of this company, Adrian. Look at this place. Look at the people here. You don't belong in this room, and neither does she. People like you need to understand your boundaries." Before Adrian could answer, the heavy double doors of the terminal opened, and a sudden silence fell over the entire lounge. Sophie Bennett had arrived. At 34, Sophie was the billionaire CEO of Vanguard Elite Aviation, a woman feared in boardrooms across the country for her ruthless negotiation tactics and absolute lack of emotional vulnerability. Tonight, she looked every bit the powerful monarch, wearing a deep black evening gown, her dark hair pulled back severely. She was flanked by James Whitcomb, a legendary international investor, and Meghan Hart, her chief of staff. Daniel immediately adjusted his tie, his arrogant demeanor melting into a sycophantic smile as he rushed toward her. "Miss Bennett, Mr. Whitcomb, welcome. I apologize for the disruption. We were just handling a trespassing issue with one of the lower-level mechanics. He will be removed immediately." Sophie Bennett paused, her cold, calculating eyes scanning the scene. She looked at Daniel, then at Victoria, and finally, her gaze landed on Adrian Cole. For a split second, something flickered in her eyes, a momentary pause, a silent calculation. Adrian did not look away, nor did he look down, like most employees did, in her presence. He met her gaze with absolute equality. Then, a small sound broke the tension. Maya, frightened by the heavy silence, accidentally dropped her small, worn, stuffed bear. The toy rolled across the polished marble, stopping right at the tips of Sophie's luxury designer heels. Daniel gasped, stepping forward to kick the toy aside. "Get that garbage out of here," he snapped. "Adrian, you are fired. Pack your things and get off my property now." But before Daniel could move, Sophie Bennett held up a single, manicured hand, freezing him in his tracks. The entire room held its breath as the cold, untouchable CEO slowly knelt down in her expensive gown, her eyes fixed on the little girl. The silence in the lounge was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass. Sophie Bennett remained on one knee, her silk gown pooling on the floor. She picked up the small, worn teddy bear. Her fingers, usually clamped around premium leather briefcases or executive fountain pens, softened as she held the fabric. She extended her hand, offering the toy back to Maya. "Thank you," Maya whispered, her voice tiny as she reached out and pulled the bear tightly against her yellow raincoat. Sophie looked at the little girl's face, seeing the pure, unvarnished innocence that money could never buy. For a fleeting second, the coldness in Sophie's eyes dissolved, replaced by a vulnerability she rarely allowed the world to see. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, inhaling a quiet breath, before she stood back up to her full height. When she turned to face Daniel Foster, the warmth vanished, replaced by the icy, intimidating gaze that had crushed competitors from New York to London. "Is this how we handle operational anomalies, Daniel?" Sophie asked, her voice dangerously quiet. By screaming at a child and firing a technician during a critical weather event, Daniel's face drained of color. He scrambled for words, his hands gesturing frantically. "Miss Bennett, please understand. This man is just a line mechanic from Hangar 4. He bypassed security protocols. The executive lounge is a restricted area. I was simply protecting the integrity of the firm and the comfort of our Tier 1 guests like Mrs. Lang." Victoria Lang shifted uncomfortably, suddenly realizing the optics of the situation under Sophie's piercing stare. Marcus Reed stepped back into the shadows of a marble pillar, completely abandoning Daniel. Adrian Cole did not use the moment to beg for his job. He didn't offer a frantic defense or look relieved that the CEO had intervened. Instead, he reached down, gently wiping a stray drop of rainwater from Maya's cheek. His calm, grounded presence acted like an anchor in the room. When he stood straight, looking directly at Sophie, there was no fear in his eyes. "The security protocols weren't bypassed," Adrian said, his voice deep and steady. "The automated gates at Hangar 4 failed when the primary transformer blew 10 minutes ago. I brought my daughter through the maintenance corridor because it's the only path with structural reinforcement during a flash flood." Sophie studied him. She noticed the way he stood, perfectly balanced, his weight distributed evenly, a posture typical of men who had spent years in high-stress, elite environments, not just turning wrenches in a damp hangar. She also noticed his hands. They were calloused, yes, but they were steady. He wasn't shaking. In her experience, every employee trembled at least a little when she looked at them this way. This man didn't. Before Daniel could interrupt again, Adrian glanced toward the floor-to-floor glass windows facing the dark runways. The wind tore through the airfield, throwing sheets of water against the glass. "You need to check the intake valves on the terminal's secondary generator," Adrian added casually, his tone completely matter-of-fact. "The lower vents are placed too close to the drainage trench. In less than 10 minutes, the rising water will flood the emergency sub-panel. When that happens, the runway guidance lights will fail." Daniel let out a forced, mocking laugh. "Now, you're an electrical engineer, Adrian?" "Miss Bennett, don't listen to him. Our engineering teams designed this terminal to withstand a hurricane. He's just trying to make himself look important after being caught where he doesn't belong." James Whitcomb, who had been watching the interaction with silent intensity, stepped forward. He looked at Adrian, then at Sophie. "The man has a point about the storm's trajectory, Sophie. The wind is shifting south." Sophie didn't answer James. She kept her eyes locked on Adrian, a sudden wave of suspicion rising within her. A standard line mechanic wouldn't know the exact elevation of the secondary generator sub-panels, nor would they analyze a storm's impact on airfield infrastructure with such clinical precision. "What did you say your name was?" Sophie asked, her voice dropping into a sharp, demanding register. "Adrian Cole," he replied simply. Before she could press him further, a sharp, piercing alarm echoed from Megan Hart's encrypted company tablet. Megan's face turned entirely white as she looked at the screen. She stumbled backward, nearly dropping the device. "Miss Bennett," Megan choked out, her voice trembling with sudden, unmitigated panic. "It's the Vanguard Avalon, the private transport from Chicago." The icy control that Sophie Bennett had maintained for years instantly shattered. She gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, her eyes widening in absolute terror. The powerful, ruthless billionaire CEO vanished in an instant, replaced by a mother frozen by primal fear. "What about the Avalon?" Sophie screamed, her voice cracking as she grabbed Megan's arm. "Tell me!" "The aircraft just entered the Seattle airspace," Megan stammered, tears welling in her eyes. "They've lost their primary navigation computer due to a lightning strike. The backup systems are glitching. And Miss Bennett, your son Julian is on that plane. They are flying blind in the middle of the storm, and they need the runway guidance lights to land. Right at that moment, a massive flash of lightning illuminated the entire sky outside, followed by a deafening roar of thunder. Inside the Skyview lounge, the overhead chandeliers flickered violently once, twice, and then plunged the entire room into total darkness. The red emergency backup lights kicked in a second later, casting a blood-red glow across the opulent marble lounge. The soft jazz was gone, replaced by the mechanical whine of a dying terminal infrastructure. Panic swept through the room like a sudden fever. Wealthy guests stumbled over chairs, champagne glasses shattered against the floor, and the thin veneer of high society elegance evaporated into raw chaos. Daniel Foster was screaming into his radio, his face twisted in a mixture of fear and incompetence. "Get the auxiliary power back up. Hangar 4, do you copy? The runway lights are dead. We have an inbound executive transport." Only static answered him. In the middle of the frantic crowd, Sophie Bennett fell to her knees. The fierce, untouchable CEO who had dominated boardrooms across the country was gone. Her hands shook violently against her knees as she stared at the dark windows. Her 9-year-old son, Julian, was trapped in the sky, caught in a blind aluminum tube descending into a blacked-out city. She tried to speak, but her throat closed up, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The money, the corporate empire, the private jets, none of it could buy the storm to stop. None of it could bring her boy down safely. "Daniel!" Sophie cried out, her voice stripped of all authority, raw with terror. "Fix it!" "Why aren't the guidance lights working? You said this terminal was indestructible." Daniel couldn't look her in the eye. He backed away, his hands trembling as he stared at the useless radio. The main breaker must have tripped. "I don't know, Miss Bennett. The automated systems aren't responding. If the subpanel is flooded, we can't manually override it from the tower." Beside them, little Maya Cole whimpered, the flashing red lights and the shouting adults terrifying her. She buried her face into Adrian's leg, her tiny shoulders shaking. Adrian did not panic. While the billionaires and executives scrambled like frightened children, his face remained a mask of absolute, quiet focus. He knelt down on the wet marble floor, completely ignoring the chaos around him. He pulled Maya into his broad chest, wrapping his strong arms around her. "Hey," Adrian whispered, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to cut right through the noise of the room. "Look at me, sweetheart." Maya raised her tear-stained face, looking into her father's calm, steady eyes. "You remember what we talked about when the big storms come?" Adrian asked, his expression warm, his thumb gently wiping away her tears. "The thunder is just the sky clearing the air. You're completely safe with me. I need you to sit right here on this leather bench, hold your bear tight, and count to 100 for me." "Can you do that?" Maya sniffled, looking at her father's unshakable face. The sheer weight of his calm security instantly transferred to her. She nodded bravely, sitting back on the bench, hugging her teddy bear close to her chest. 1, 2, 3, she began to whisper. Sophie Bennett witnessed the entire interaction. Through her own blinding panic, she saw the absolute contrast between the useless, screaming executives around her and this quiet, single father who possessed an emotional security that money could never purchase. She remembered his words from just minutes before the lights went out. He had predicted this exact failure. He had known the secondary generator would flood. She lunged forward, grabbing Adrian by the sleeve of his faded navy jacket. Her expensive rings dug into his arm, her eyes wide and begging. "Adrian," Sophie choked out, her pride completely shattered. "You knew. You said the subpanel would flood. Please, my son is on that plane. Julian is up there. The pilots can't see the runway. Tell me what to do. Please save my boy." Adrian stood up to his full height, his gaze shifting from Sophie to the dark, rain-swept airfield outside. The storm was reaching its peak, violent gusts shaking the heavy glass panels of the lounge. "The automated override is useless now," Adrian said, his tone commanding and precise. He didn't waste time with comforting lies. He gave her the hard truth. The drainage trench overflowed, just like I said. The secondary generator subpanel is fully submerged under 3 feet of water. If anyone tries to flip the standard switch in the hangar, they'll trigger a catastrophic short circuit that will permanently fry the airfield's entire electrical grid. If that happens, those runway lights will never turn back on tonight. Daniel Foster staggered back over, his face flushed with anger and desperation. "Then we're finished. The pilots have less than 15 minutes of reserve fuel before they have to attempt a blind landing in a flash flood. Who do you think you are, Adrian? You're just a mechanic. You don't know the schematic of the primary grid. Adrian turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Daniel with a cold, terrifying intensity that made the senior vice president step back in silence. I know this grid because I helped design the prototype for the military variants. Adrian said softly, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. James Whitcomb's head snapped up at those words, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the humble single dad. Adrian turned back to Sophie, his presence completely taking over the room. There is a manual analog bypass buried beneath the old auxiliary hangar floor. It's a mechanical pressure valve that diverts fuel directly to an old underground diesel generator from the 1980s. It's completely separate from the digital grid. If I can get to it and clear the old intake lines by hand, I can force the runway lights back on for exactly 12 minutes. Then go, Sophie pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Please, Adrian, I'll give you anything. Name your price. Millions. A partnership. Just bring my son down. I don't want your money, Miss Bennett, Adrian said quietly, adjusting the collar of his jacket. I'm going because a child is in danger. He turned to James Whitcomb, pointing a finger at the older investor. Keep an eye on my daughter. Don't let anyone move her from that bench. James, a man who commanded billions, nodded instantly without a second thought. You have my word, son. Go. Adrian looked down at Maya one last time, giving her a reassuring nod, then turned and ran straight out into the roaring, pitch-black storm. The freezing wind tore across the open tarmac of the Seattle airfield, ripping at Adrian's jacket as he drove forward through the blinding downpour. Water surged past his boots, swirling in deep, dangerous currents around the landing gear of parked corporate jets. He couldn't see more than 5 feet ahead, but he didn't need to. He knew this airfield better than the people who owned it. He closed his eyes for a split second, mapping the underground conduit lines in his mind, and sprinted toward the rusted steel silhouette of Hangar 9, the abandoned auxiliary structure left over from the airfield's mid-century expansion. Back inside the Skyview lounge, the red emergency lights pulsed like a slow, dying heartbeat. The atmosphere was thick with suffocating tension. Sophie Bennett paced back and forth in front of the massive glass windows, her hands pressed tightly against her chest. Every few seconds, she looked up at the black sky, praying for a glimpse of her son's aircraft, but there was only darkness and the terrifying roar of the gale. She stopped pacing and looked toward the leather bench. Little Maya was still sitting there, hugging her worn teddy bear. Her small voice was barely a murmur over the sound of the storm. 42, 43, 44. Sophie felt a sudden, sharp ache in her chest. She had all the wealth in the world, yet she was completely helpless, while this little girl sat in perfect peace because she believed in her father. Slowly, Sophie walked over and sank onto the bench beside Maya. The ruthless billionaire executive looked entirely human, her shoulders trembling as she looked at the child. Maya, Sophie said softly, her voice shaking. Aren't you scared? The lights are out. The storm is very loud. Maya stopped counting and looked up at Sophie, her innocent brown eyes completely calm. No, my daddy told me to wait here. He said I'm safe. So, I'm safe. My daddy always fixes the broken things. He used to fix the giant jets with the secret military stars on the wings. He can fix anything. James Whitcomb, standing just a few feet away, overheard the little girl's words. His eyes widened, his sharp mind instantly connecting the pieces. He stepped closer, staring at Maya in stunned realization. But before he could speak, Daniel Foster interrupted them. Daniel had been pacing near the bar, his anxiety turning into malicious desperation. He saw an opportunity to shift the blame away from his own failure. Miss Bennett, you cannot seriously trust that mechanic. Look at the data. He's been gone 5 minutes. He probably ran out to the parking lot to save his own skin and left his kid here. He's a low-level line worker. He doesn't have the capability to override a corporate power grid. We are wasting critical time listening to a man who handles garbage disposal for a living. Sophie stood up slowly. The sheer, freezing fury in her eyes made Daniel freeze mid-sentence. She stepped toward him, her voice dropping into a dangerous, lethal whisper that echoed clearly through the quiet room. Daniel, Sophie said, her hands clenching into fists. If my son's plane does not land safely tonight, I will spend every single dollar of my fortune to ensure you are stripped of your title, your wealth, and your freedom. I will audit every corner of your operations, and I will make sure you never see the light of day again. Adrian Cole went out into a life-threatening storm while you stood here crying into a dead radio. Do not speak his name again. Daniel stumbled backward, his face turning an ash-gray color, his mouth opening and closing without a sound. He had been completely, utterly crushed in front of the remaining board members. Suddenly, Megan Hart let out a sharp cry from the data console. Miss Bennett, the Avalon is on final approach. The pilots just sent a high-frequency emergency broadcast. They have less than 4 minutes of fuel remaining. They are descending through the low cloud cover right now, but they can't see the runway markers. They are flying completely blind. At that exact moment, over 300 yards away inside the flooded basement of Hangar 9, Adrian Cole was submerged to his waist in freezing, muddy water. The dark chamber smelled of old rust and diesel. He shined a small pocket flashlight onto the wall, locating the heavy, mechanical analog bypass assembly. The system was completely dead, covered in decades of grime. Adrian grabbed the massive iron lever of the pressure valve. He pulled with all his strength, his muscles straining against the rusted metal, but the mechanism wouldn't budge. The old military-grade locking system was engaged, requiring a specific, sequential safety code to release the mechanical weights. He didn't hesitate. He reached into the control box, bypassing the broken digital interface, and began manually clicking the internal tumblers by touch alone using a highly classified encryption rhythm known only to elite naval aviation engineers who worked on experimental carriers. 3 rapid clicks, a long pause, 2 heavy turns to the left. Clack, clack, clack. Back in the terminal, Megan's console suddenly beeped. A single, isolated sector of the auxiliary grid on her monitor flickered from dead black to a glowing amber. What is that? Megan whispered, her fingers flying over the screen. Someone just bypassed the secure hardware level. That's a restricted military encryption signature. How is that possible? James Whitcomb leaned over her shoulder, his face grim. Because that man isn't just a mechanic, Megan. Out in the flooded hangar basement, Adrian threw his entire weight against the iron lever one last time. With a loud, grinding screech of metal, the valve finally gave way. Deep beneath the concrete floor, a massive, ancient diesel engine roared to life with a deafening mechanical rumble. The entire hangar shook. Through the windows of the lounge, Sophie watched as a single line of brilliant, high-intensity white guidance lights slammed on across the main runway, cutting right through the black storm like a shining highway. He did it, Sophie gasped, tears of relief flooding her eyes. He did it! But before the crowd could cheer, a violent, metallic explosion echoed from the direction of Hangar 9. On Megan's monitor, the amber sector flared a bright, warning red, and the newly lit runway lights began to flicker erratically. Adrian! Sophie screamed into the primary maintenance radio on the counter. Adrian, do you copy? What's happening? Through the static, Adrian's voice came through, but it was strained, heavy with physical exertion and immediate danger. The main pressure pipe just ruptured from the old fuel surge. The lower chamber is flooding completely, and the generator is choking on water. The lights won't hold for more than 60 seconds unless I stay down here and hold the manual intake valve open by hand. The radio suddenly cut out into a loud, screeching whine of static, leaving the lounge in a horrified silence as the runway lights outside began to fade back into the dark. The silence inside the terminal lounge was suffocating, broken only by the crackle of white noise bleeding from the command console. Sophie Bennett stared at the radio in her hand, her fingers turning white from the force of her grip. Outside, the high-intensity runway lights sputtered like dying stars, fighting against the thick sheets of rain. Adrian! Sophie cried out again, her voice cracking with an agony she had never shown in any boardroom. Adrian, please answer me. Get out of there. The water is too high. There was no reply. The speaker only offered the hollow hiss of the storm. Megan Hart stared at her tracking screen, her face completely pale. The Avalon just cleared the outer marker. They are descending past 400 feet. Miss Bennett, if the lights go dark now, the pilots won't have the visual reference to adjust for the severe crosswinds. They'll overshoot the tarmac and hit the retaining wall by the river. Sophie turned toward the window, her breath fogging the glass. Her heart pounded against her ribs so violently it felt physical. She was a woman who had built an empire by controlling every variable, by predicting every move of her adversaries. Yet here, stripped of her corporate armor, she was just a mother watching the dark sky, completely dependent on a man she had looked down on only an hour ago. James Whitcomb stepped up beside her, his expression grim but deeply focused. He wasn't looking at the sky. He was looking at the technical telemetry blinking on Megan's screen. "He won't leave," James said quietly, his voice carrying a strange, heavy reverence. Sophie snapped her head around, tears tracking down her cheeks. "What are you talking about?" "The basement is flooding. He's going to drown down there if he doesn't let go of that valve." "You don't understand who is down there, Sophie," James said, his eyes narrowing as he watched the unique military encryption codes refreshing on the monitor. 6 years ago, before Vanguard Elite purchased this terminal, the Department of Defense ran a highly classified development project for tactical all-weather landing systems. The lead engineer was a legendary Navy commander, a man who single-handedly saved an entire squadron of fighter jets during a typhoon by manually stabilizing a damaged carrier deck grid. He disappeared from the grid after a personal tragedy. I've spent 3 years trying to track him down to run our global tech division. Sophie stared at James, the words slowly sinking through her panic. "Adrian? Look at the data override pattern," James whispered, pointing at the screen. "That's not a line mechanic's work. That is Commander Adrian Cole. He isn't holding that valve because he's an employee, Sophie. He's holding it because it's his mission. And men like him do not abandon their post when a life is on the line." Down in the pitch-black depths of Hangar 9, the freezing water had reached Adrian's chest. The dark current pulled at him, trying to tear his boots from the submerged floor. The iron intake valve vibrated violently under his hands, screaming under the immense hydraulic pressure of the ruptured fuel line. The burning pain in his shoulders was absolute, his muscles tearing under the strain of holding the massive lever in place. He could hear the metal groaning around him. He could feel the lethal electric current humming through the wet air as the water approached the generator's primary housing. One slip, one moment of weakness, and the lever would slam shut, plunging the runway back into total darkness and killing the child in the sky. Adrian grit his teeth, a low, primal growl escaping his throat as he forced his boots deeper into the mud. He didn't think about the cold. He didn't think about the water rising toward his chin. He thought of Maya sitting on the leather bench up in the warm lounge, counting to 100. He thought of the desperate mother who had begged him to save her boy. He had lost his own wife to an unforgiving illness years ago, and he had promised himself he would never let another family feel the crushing weight of an empty chair if he had the power to stop it. "Hold," Adrian muttered to himself, his knuckles white, his breath coming in ragged gasps as a wave of icy water splashed against his mouth. "Just hold." Upstairs, the wind let out a deafening shriek. Through the dense cloud cover, 2 brilliant beams of white light broke through the fog. The Vanguard Avalon was visible now, a massive steel shadow tilting dangerously in the heavy crosswinds, its engines roaring at maximum thrust as the pilots fought the storm. 30 seconds to touchdown, Megan screamed, her hands flying to her hair. "The landing gear is down, but they are drifting off the center line. The lights are dropping voltage." On the runway below, the high-intensity markers flickered violently, dropping to half their brightness. Sophie pressed both hands against the glass, her knees buckling. "Adrian, please," she whispered into the dark window, her voice a fragile plea. "Just a few more seconds. Please." Daniel Foster stood near the back wall, his face completely hollow, realizing that every word James Whitcomb had spoken had sealed his own professional doom. Marcus Reed kept his eyes glued to the window, the arrogant smirk completely gone from his face, replaced by absolute awe. The Avalon dropped lower, its nose pitching upward as it cleared the threshold of the runway. The tires shrieked against the wet asphalt, sending massive plumes of white water into the air. The plane bounced once, dangerously close to the edge, before the nose wheel slammed down firmly right between the glowing lines of the auxiliary guidance lights. The heavy thrust reversers engaged with a thunderous roar that shook the glass of the terminal. The aircraft slowed, tracing the straight path of the light highway until it finally came to a safe, controlled stop at the far end of the taxiway. Inside the lounge, a collective gasp echoed through the room, followed by a stunned, emotional silence. "They're down," Megan whispered, tears finally spilling over her eyes. "They're safe. The aircraft is secure." Sophie fell against the window frame, sobbing openly, her hands sliding down the glass as the immense weight of terror lifted from her chest. She looked toward Maya, who had stopped counting and was smiling brightly, holding her teddy bear high. But the relief lasted only a heartbeat. On the data console, the amber sector suddenly vanished completely, plunging back into a cold, dead black. Outside, the runway lights died instantly, returning the airfield to the dark. "The Hangar 9 grid just went completely offline," Megan announced, her voice dropping into a horrified whisper. "The emergency generator didn't shut down, Miss Bennett. It blew." Sophie's heart stopped. She grabbed the radio off the counter, her voice screaming into the static. Adrian! Adrian! Can you hear me? The plane is safe! Adrian! The radio remained completely silent. Sophie didn't hesitate. She turned away from the window and ran straight toward the exit doors, sprinting into the pitch-black storm toward the flooded airfield. The heavy security doors of the terminal slammed open, and the ferocious Seattle wind instantly ripped the breath from Sophie's lungs. Rain lashed against her face, ruining her hair and soaking her expensive silk gown within seconds, but she didn't care. She ran. She pushed past the terminal boundary markers, her high heels twisting on the slick asphalt until she ripped them off completely, throwing them into the darkness and sprinting barefoot across the freezing, flooded tarmac. In the distance, the flashing red and blue lights of airfield emergency vehicles were already converging on Hangar 9. Thick gray smoke was billowing out of the structure's ventilation shafts, fighting against the heavy downpour. Sophie arrived just as the first rescue crew slammed their vehicle into park. She pushed through the line of mechanics and first responders, her voice screaming over the roar of the engines. "Adrian! Is he out? Did anyone see him?" A senior fire chief grabbed her by the shoulders, holding her back from the smoking entrance. "Ma'am, you can't go in there. The sublevel has completely flooded, and there's an active electrical fire in the main housing. We are preparing a dive team now." Sophie's world narrowed to a sharp, suffocating point of despair. She looked at the dark, smoking maw of the hangar basement stairs, the water swirling down into it like a black whirlpool. She had saved her company, saved her fortune, and saved her son, but the cost was the life of the only man who had shown genuine humanity in a room full of monsters. Then, a sudden shout went up from the edge of the rescue line. Through the dense, chemical smoke pouring from the hangar doors, a tall, imposing silhouette began to emerge. He walked slowly, his steps heavy but unyielding. Adrian Cole stepped out into the pouring rain. He was soaked to the bone, his faded navy jacket scorched black across the shoulders, and his hands were raw and bleeding from the friction of the iron lever. He was coughing violently, his chest heaving as he drew the clean, cold night air into his lungs. But he did not fall. He kept walking, upright and unbroken, moving by sheer force of will. Sophie broke away from the fire chief's grip and ran toward him. She stopped just 2 feet away, her breath catching in her throat as she looked at his bruised face and bleeding hands. For the first time in her life, the billionaire CEO was completely speechless, her chest rising and falling with raw, unedited emotion. "The aircraft," Adrian rasped out. His deep voice cracked and strained from the smoke, but his eyes were instantly searching hers for an answer. "Did the boy make it down? He's safe?" Sophie choked out, tears mixing with the rain streaming down her face. "Julian is safe. The plane landed perfectly right on the center line. You did it, Adrian. You saved him." Adrian closed his eyes for a brief moment, a single deep breath of profound relief escaping his chest. The tight, defensive posture he had maintained all night finally eased by a fraction. He nodded once, a quiet, factual acceptance of a mission accomplished. Good. That's all that matters. He bypassed the medical team that rushed forward with blankets, gently pushing their hands aside. "I need to get back to the lounge," he said, his voice dropping back into its familiar, calm register. "My daughter is waiting for me." 10 minutes later, the grand double doors of the Skyview Executive Lounge parted once again. The elite crowd of shareholders, executives, and high society guests had gathered near the center of the room, talking in hushed, anxious whispers. The moment Adrian walked into the room, flanked by Sophie Bennett, the entire lounge plunged into a dead, paralyzed silence. Adrian looked like a warrior returning from a battlefield. He was dripping water onto the pristine marble floor, his hands wrapped in temporary white medical gauze, his jacket torn. Yet, as he walked through the space, the sheer gravity of his presence commanded the room. No one laughed. No one muttered about boundaries or rainwater. The arrogance that had filled the lounge an hour ago had been completely crushed. Maya looked up from her bench. Her face lit up with absolute joy, and she sprinted across the polished floor, throwing her small arms around her father's wet leg. "Daddy, I counted all the way to 104 times. I knew you would fix the lights." Adrian immediately dropped to his knees, completely ignoring his injuries as he scooped his daughter up into his broad chest, holding her tightly against his shoulder. "I told you I'd come back, sweetheart. You did a great job." At that exact moment, the private secure arrival doors at the back of the lounge clicked open. A flight crew in pristine uniforms walked out, guiding a 9-year-old boy in a thick winter coat. "Mom!" Julian screamed, his eyes locking onto Sophie. Sophie flew across the room, dropping to her knees and burying her face into her son's shoulder, sobbing openly as she held him. The powerful, ruthless CEO was gone. There was only a mother holding her miracle. Julian looked confused but hugged her tightly, holding his own small travel bag. The captain of the Vanguard Avalon, a decorated senior pilot named Captain Thomas Vance, stepped forward. His face was still pale from the adrenaline of the blind descent. He looked around the executive lounge, his eyes scanning the wealthy board members until they landed on James Whitcomb. "Mr. Whitcomb," Captain Vance said, his voice echoing clearly through the silent room, "I need to know who was operating the auxiliary grid tonight. We lost every instrument at 500 feet. We were less than 20 seconds from a catastrophic impact. Whoever forced those analog guidance lights to turn on manually saved my life, my crew's lives, and your grandson's life. That wasn't a standard procedure. That was an impossible piece of engineering under combat-level conditions. Who did it?" James Whitcomb smiled a slow, grim smile. He turned his body completely, extending a hand toward the single father standing in the center of the room with his daughter in his arms. "Meet Commander Adrian Cole," James announced, his powerful voice ringing with absolute reverence. Former Chief of Naval Aerospace Logistics and the lead tactical architect of the United States Pacific Fleet's all-weather landing systems. The man you just called a low-level line mechanic, Daniel. A collective gasp rippled through the elite crowd. Victoria Lang raised her hand to her mouth, her face turning a deep crimson color as she stared at the man she had insulted. Marcus Reed stepped back, his eyes wide with absolute terror, realizing the monumental scale of his mistake. But the absolute worst of it fell on Daniel Foster. The senior vice president looked as though he had been struck by lightning. His mouth hung open, his skin a pasty, sickly green, as the entire room turned to look at him, their gazes filled with sharp, public condemnation. The power dynamic had completely, irrevocably reversed. Daniel Foster looked as though the ground had vanished beneath his feet. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the silent room as he looked from James Whitcomb to the battered, soaking wet figure of Adrian Cole. The junior executives who had been standing near Daniel just moments ago quietly took a step back, separating themselves from a man whose career was disintegrating in real time. Victoria Lang slowly lowered her glass, her face pale, unable to meet Adrian's level gaze. Captain Thomas Vance walked past Daniel without a glance, stopping directly in front of Adrian. Despite being in his full flight uniform, the veteran captain brought his right hand up to his brow, executing a crisp, flawless military salute to the line mechanic. "I didn't recognize you without the whites, Commander," Captain Vance said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I should have known. Nobody else in the world could have balanced that grid by touch. Thank you for bringing us home." Adrian kept Maya secured against his shoulder with one arm, extending his wrapped right hand to shake the captain's. "You held the center line in a 50-knot crosswind, Thomas. That was exceptional flying. Go check on your crew." The captain nodded, casting one last look of profound respect at Adrian before turning to guide his co-pilot toward the operations office. Sophie Bennett stepped forward, the ruin of her expensive silk gown completely forgotten. She stood beside Adrian, her presence radiating a quiet, lethal authority that made the remaining board members straighten up in fear. She looked down at Daniel Foster, who was trembling, his hands twitching at his sides. "Miss Bennett," Daniel stammered, his voice high and desperate. "I was only following the standard security protocol for unauthorized personnel. I had no idea about the commander's background." "If I had known..." "That is exactly your failure, Daniel." Sophie cut him off, her voice like cracking ice. "You treat people based on what you think they can do for your career, rather than their basic human worth. You saw a man in a technician's jacket and decided he was disposable. You would have let my son die tonight to protect the cleanliness of a marble floor." She took half a step closer, her dark eyes locking onto his with absolute finality. "You are stripped of your equity, your title, and your security clearance. You have 10 minutes to clear your desk before security escorts you from the perimeter. If I see your face on Vanguard property again, I will personally ensure the legal department dismantles your life." Daniel looked around the room for help, but every single shareholder and executive avoided his eyes. Realizing he was utterly ruined, he turned and walked toward the exit, his shoulders slumped, his previous arrogance completely shattered. Victoria Lang quietly slipped out behind him, her head down, eager to escape the suffocating judgment of the room. Marcus Reed stood frozen by the pillar. Sophie's gaze drifted to him next. Mr. Reed, you will take over Daniel's immediate operational duties for the next 12 hours. Your first task is to ensure every family member of our ground crew is provided warm shelter and standard hazard pay for tonight's storm. If I hear a single complaint, you will follow Daniel out the door. Yes, Miss Bennett. Right away, Marcus whispered, moving quickly toward the communications desk, his entire demeanor entirely humbled. James Whitcomb walked over, his face softening as he looked at little Julian, who was holding tightly to Sophie's hand. James set a heavy, grateful hand on Adrian's uninjured shoulder. You saved my family, Adrian. A lifetime of gratitude won't cover what you did tonight. He doesn't owe me anything, Mr. Whitcomb, Adrian said quietly. The boy is safe. That's the balance sheet. Sophie watched Adrian as he spoke. The stark contrast between the men she usually dealt with, men who negotiated every favor and demanded a price for every breath, and this quiet, grounded single father was overwhelming. She noticed the small, protective way he kept his hand over Maya's head, shielding her even now from the stress of the room. Julian pulled on Sophie's gown, looking up at Maya. Is that the girl who sat on the bench? Sophie knelt down, her voice dropping into a gentle, rare warmth. Yes, Julian. That's Maya. Her dad is the reason your plane could see the ground. Julian walked over to Adrian's side, looking up at the large man with wide, adoring eyes. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, silver model airplane, a rare collector's piece his grandfather had given him. He held it out toward Maya. You can have this if you want. Your dad is cooler than a superhero. Maya peeked out from Adrian's neck, her eyes shining as she looked at the toy. She looked at her father for permission. Adrian offered a small, rare smile and nodded. Maya reached down, taking the silver plane. Thank you. My dad is the best engineer in the whole world. The small interaction brought a profound silence to the immediate circle. Sophie stood back up, stepping closer to Adrian. The crowd of executives had drifted to the far side of the lounge, giving them a deliberate pocket of privacy. The air between Adrian and Sophie changed, coat sticking away from the high-stakes adrenaline of the emergency into something deeper, quieter, and intensely personal. Sophie looked at the white gauze wrapped around his large hands, seeing the small drops of blood soaking through the fabric. Without thinking, her hand lifted, her fingers hovering just an inch away from his wrist, trembling slightly. You're hurt, she said softly, her cold public persona entirely gone. Her voice was vulnerable, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with business. You need a real hospital, Adrian, not just terminal first aid. I've had worse on carrier decks, Adrian replied, his deep voice dropping an octave, meant only for her. He met her brown eyes, and for the first time, he didn't see the ruthless executive. He saw a woman who had spent years building walls to keep the world out, only to realize those walls couldn't protect the things she loved the most. I'll take care of it once Maya is home. Let me take you, Sophie said, her eyes locked onto his, refusing to look away. My personal car is waiting in the lower garage. The roads are clear now. Let me take you and Maya, please. Adrian studied her face in the dim light of the restored auxiliary chandeliers. He saw the genuine sincerity, the quiet plea for a chance to give back a fraction of the security he had provided her. He nodded slowly. All right, Sophie, thank you. As they began to move toward the private elevator, Megan Hart rushed over, holding a secure satellite phone. Miss Bennett, the International Board of Directors is on line 1. They've heard about the grid failure and the emergency landing. They are demanding an immediate press statement regarding the operational leadership of the Seattle hub. Sophie didn't even look at the phone. She kept her eyes on Adrian and Maya. Tell the board that the operational leadership of this hub has just changed. Tell them I am currently escorting the new global vice president of operations to the hospital, and if they have a problem with that, they can sell their shares by morning. She turned back to Adrian, a genuine, beautiful smile breaking across her face for the first time in years, while Adrian simply watched her with his calm, unshakable strength. The smooth ride of the luxury custom SUV cut through the lingering mist of the retreating storm as the vehicle glided toward the private medical wing of Mercer Heights Hospital. Inside the cabin, the quiet purr of the engine was the only sound. In the back seat, little Maya had already fallen fast asleep, her head resting gently on Julian's shoulder. Julian sat perfectly still, holding his breath as if any sudden movement might wake her, his small hand still holding the silver model airplane. Sophie Bennett steered the vehicle with a steady hand, but her eyes kept drifting to the rearview mirror, and then to the silent man sitting in the passenger seat beside her. Adrian Cole stared out at the passing city lights, his expression relaxed, his broad shoulders resting against the premium leather. The white gauze on his hands was slightly stained, but his breathing was slow and even. "I spent my entire life building an empire so that no one could ever make me feel helpless again," Sophie said softly, breaking the long silence. Her voice was stripped of its executive edge, sounding fragile in the dim dashboard light. "Tonight, I realized I had everything. Billions of dollars, a fleet of aircraft, international influence, and none of it mattered. I was completely powerless to save the only thing that gave my life meaning." Adrian turned his head slowly, meeting her gaze. The passing street lamps illuminated the deep lines of his face, reflecting the calm maturity that had anchored her through the worst night of her life. "Money buys options, Sophie," Adrian said, his deep voice low and reassuring. "It doesn't buy safety, and it certainly doesn't buy peace. You were trying to protect your son the only way you knew how. There's no shame in that." Sophie felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation in her chest, a sudden loosening of a knot she had carried for years. She had spent a decade surrounded by men who used her vulnerability as a target. Yet this man, who had every right to gloat or demand a reward, simply offered her a safe place to land. She realized then the profound truth of what she was feeling. She had everything in the world, except peace. And this man gave safety without even trying. When they arrived at the hospital's private entrance, James Whitcomb was already waiting in the lobby, accompanied by Megan Hart. A team of elite physicians immediately gathered around Adrian, but he insisted on carrying the sleeping Maya inside himself, refusing to let her go until she was safely settled on a bed in the private recovery suite. As the doctors began treating Adrian's burned and lacerated hands, James Whitcomb walked into the room, holding a thick, black leather folder. His face carried a triumphant, almost fierce expression of justice served. "The board just completed the emergency auditory trace on Daniel Foster's corporate accounts," James announced, setting the folder on the table beside Adrian. When Daniel realized he was ruined, he tried to download a proprietary encryption algorithm from our secure servers to sell to our competitors in Chicago. He thought he could steal the core navigation logic as a parting gift. Sophie's eyes narrowed, her corporate instincts instantly returning. "Did he get away with it?" James let out a low, gravelly laugh, looking at Adrian with absolute reverence. He didn't even get past the first firewall. The moment he initiated the transfer, the entire Vanguard network locked him out and flagged his location for the federal authorities. "He was arrested in the parking lot 5 minutes ago, but that's not the interesting part, Sophie." Sophie looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" "The legal department had to pull the original patent registration to verify the theft," James explained, a massive smile breaking across his weathered face. "The core technology Vanguard Elite Aviation uses, the very system that keeps our global operations alive, was patented 10 years ago. Our accounting department has been sending multi-million-dollar royalty payments every single month to a private, heavily encrypted blind trust in Delaware called Aegis Holdings." Sophie turned her head slowly, her breath catching as she looked at Adrian, who was calmly watching the doctor apply a fresh layer of sterile dressing to his palm. James opened the black leather folder, pointing directly to the ultimate beneficiary disclosure page. "Our HR and accounting teams only saw a corporate entity on paper, Sophie. But look who owns 100% of Aegis Holdings. Commander Adrian Cole. He is the original inventor of our entire navigation architecture. He didn't take a line mechanic job because he needed the money. He used the blind trust to hide his massive wealth, slipping into a quiet, anonymous technician jacket just to raise his daughter in peace, away from the corporate sharks." The room fell into a stunned, emotional silence. Sophie stared at the man sitting on the examination table. The ultimate twist had landed. The man her executives had treated like garbage, the single father they tried to throw out into the rain, was actually the secret foundation upon which her entire billionaire empire was built. He was her equal in every single way, possessing both the wealth she respected and the moral clarity she lacked. "Why didn't you say anything?" Sophie whispered, her eyes shining with absolute awe. "When Daniel insulted you, when they tried to humiliate you, you could have destroyed him with a single phone call." Adrian looked down at his wrapped hands, then across the room at Maya, who was sleeping peacefully under a warm blanket. "An unlined uniform doesn't make a man, Sophie," Adrian said quietly, his voice filled with a profound, quiet masculinity. I didn't care what Daniel thought of me. His opinion has no value. My only priority was keeping my daughter safe and doing my job. I don't need a title to know who I am. Sophie walked over to him, stopping just inches away. The distance between them dissolved entirely. For the first time, she reached out, her hand gently wrapping around his forearm, her touchlight warm and filled with a deep, undeniable admiration. "You accepted the vice president position tonight," she said, her voice dropping into an intimate register meant only for him. "I meant what I said to the board. I need you, Adrian. Vanguard needs you. And my son needs to know what a real hero looks like." Adrian looked at her hand on his arm, then up into her eyes, seeing the rare, genuine warmth that had finally broken through her icy exterior. "I'll take the position on one condition," Adrian replied, a soft smile appearing on his face. "Name it," Sophie said without a second thought. "Hangar 4 gets a brand new heating system by Monday morning," Adrian said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "And the ground crew gets a permanent seat at the executive table. Safety starts from the floor up." Sophie let out a genuine, beautiful laugh, her heart feeling lighter than it had in a lifetime. Consider it done. 2 weeks later, the morning sun broke brightly over the Seattle skyline, casting long, golden beams across the pristine tarmac of the newly renovated Vanguard Elite Terminal. The airfield was buzzing with activity, but the atmosphere was completely changed. The line mechanics and technicians walked with their heads held high, wearing new, premium gear, their contributions finally respected by the suits upstairs. Near the edge of the private runway, a brand new corporate transport plane sat gleaming in the sunlight. Standing near the wing were Adrian and Sophie, side by side. Adrian wore a tailored charcoal wool coat that matched his commanding presence, his hands completely healed. Sophie looked radiant in a soft cream blazer, her dark hair flowing loosely around her shoulders, her expression peaceful. A few yards away on the lush green grass bordering the tarmac, Maya and Julian were running together, laughing loudly as they chased each other, flying the silver model airplane through the crisp morning air. James Whitcomb stood near the terminal entrance, watching the scene over the rim of his coffee cup, a deep sense of satisfaction in his eyes. The universe had a way of balancing the books, and today, justice had been fully served. Sophie shifted closer to Adrian, her shoulder brushing against his as they watched the children play. The future stretched out before them, no longer cold, no longer guarded, but filled with a bright, unshakable hope. "I think Julian is losing his competitive edge," Sophie murmured, a playful smile lifting the corner of her mouth. "He's letting Maya win every race." Adrian let out a low, deep chuckle, his large hand gently sliding down to find hers, his fingers interlocking with hers in a quiet, protective grip. "He's just learning what I learned, Sophie," Adrian said softly, looking down at her with absolute devotion. "That sometimes, the greatest victory in the world is simply making sure the people you care about feel safe enough to fly." Sophie squeezed his hand tightly, leaning into his strength as the laughter of their children filled the open sky, signaling the beautiful beginning of a brand new story.